The Roman slave policy was an integral part of Roman society and economy. Slavery was a widespread and deeply embedded institution in ancient Rome, affecting every aspect of life from agriculture to domestic work, and even intellectual pursuits. Sources of slaves. War captives. The primary source of slaves was warfare. After Roman victories, prisoners of war were often enslaved. Major campaigns like the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar or wars against Carthage brought tens of thousands of slaves into the Roman system. Piracy and kidnapping. In coastal regions, piracy was another source of slaves, with victims sold into slavery in Roman markets. Slave trade. There was a well-organized market for slaves in Rome. Slaves were bought and sold in public auctions or private markets across the empire. Debt slavery. Though less common by the late Republic and Empire, earlier in Roman history, debtors could become slaves if they could not pay their debts. Natural reproduction. Children born to enslaved women, regardless of the status of the father, were automatically considered slaves.
Types of slavery. Domestic slaves. These slaves served in Roman households, performing tasks such as cooking, cleaning, child rearing, and personal services for their masters. Wealthy Romans might own hundreds of slaves for domestic purposes. Agricultural slaves. Large estates, latifundia, relied on gangs of slaves to farm vast tracts of land. These slaves often lived in harsh conditions and worked long hours in the fields. Industrial slaves. Slaves worked in industries like mining, construction, and manufacturing. Mining in particular was considered one of the most brutal forms of labor due to the hazardous conditions. Public slaves. These slaves were owned by the state rather than private individuals. They worked on public projects such as maintaining public buildings, baths, and roads, or serving as clerks in government offices. Gladiators. Some slaves were trained as gladiators, fighting for entertainment in arenas. While most gladiators lived dangerous and short lives, successful ones could gain fame, wealth, or even their freedom.
Legal status of slaves. Property, not people. Slaves in Rome were considered the property of their masters. They had no legal personhood and could be bought, sold, punished, or even killed at the master's discretion. Manumission. Despite their low status, slaves could be freed by their masters through a formal process called manumission. Freed slaves, freedmen or freedwomen, were granted limited Roman citizenship, but often remained clients, dependents, of their former masters. Legal protections. Over time, Roman laws gradually introduced some protections for slaves. For example, the Emperor Hadrian forbade masters from killing slaves without just cause, and Antoninus Pius decreed that if a master killed a slave unjustly, it would be considered murder. Despite this, slaves still had few rights.
Life as a slave. Living conditions. The life of a slave varied widely depending on their role. Domestic slaves in wealthy households often lived relatively comfortable lives, sometimes even being highly educated and trusted. On the other hand, slaves in mines, farms, or as gladiators often endured extreme conditions, facing harsh punishments, malnutrition, and lack of proper shelter. Punishments. Masters had full authority to punish slaves. Common forms of punishment included beatings, branding, and forced labor in harsher conditions. For serious offenses, crucifixion was a frequent punishment. Opportunities for advancement. In some cases, skilled or educated slaves could rise to positions of considerable influence within a household or business. Some slaves became wealthy after being freed, though they remained legally limited in status compared to freeborn Roman citizens.
Role in the economy. Slaves were essential to the Roman economy. They worked in nearly every sector, including agriculture, industry, and domestic service. The reliance on slave labor allowed Roman elites to accumulate vast wealth. The economy of large estates, particularly in Italy, depended on the labor of thousands of enslaved people, who formed the backbone of agricultural production, especially in producing grain, olives, and wine.
Slave revolts. Spartacus Revolt, 73 to 71 BCE. The most famous slave revolt in Roman history was led by the gladiator Spartacus, who raised an army of slaves and fought against the Roman legions. Though initially successful, Spartacus' rebellion was ultimately crushed, and thousands of captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a warning to others. There were several other, smaller-scale slave revolts, but the system of control in Rome was designed to suppress rebellion, making large-scale revolts relatively rare. Changing attitudes toward slavery. As the Roman Empire progressed, some philosophical and religious currents, such as Stoicism and later Christianity, began to criticize the moral foundations of slavery. These movements emphasized the equality of all human beings under natural law or before God. However, while these ideas influenced the individual attitudes, they did not lead to the abolition of slavery in the Roman world.
Decline of slavery. By the late Roman Empire, 4th to 5th centuries CE, slavery began to decline, partly due to changes in the economy. The rise of colony, free tenant farmers, and a shift toward a feudal-like system reduced the need for slaves in agriculture, though slavery persisted in some forms. Slavery in Rome was a brutal system of exploitation, but it also had social and legal complexities. Despite the occasional opportunities for advancement or manumission, most slaves lived harsh, dehumanized lives, subject to the whims of their masters. Thank you for watching the video, The Roman Slave Policy, provided by History and Current Events. This is Sarah and Gina, Lily, Bill, Brian, and Tony have also contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.